Stockpiling food during World War II became a survival game every family was determined to win. They turned it into a challenge, experimenting with unique foods that could sustain them through the war. Sounds odd to make stockpiling fun, doesn't it? Just wait until you hear what they came up with. So we're going to start off with ration chocolate, which, when imagined, was rooted entirely in the need for something like that thanks to the war. Especially during the second one, though it was developed all the way back in the First World War. You could probably call this kind of thing the first kind of protein bar, since it was exactly like that for soldiers. They needed some way to get transportable, high-energy, high-protein nutrition that was fast and easy to eat. Plus, it needed to be easy to store and something that could deal with the fact that conditions weren't going to be ideal for a while. Actually, one of the most famous bars was made by the Hershey Company exclusively for use in wartime by soldiers. It was known as the D-ration bar, and it was created with around 600 calories. This thing wasn't like your average chocolate bar at all. While the typical Dairy Milk or Kit Kat might start melting around a toasty 40 degrees Fahrenheit, this bar could withstand all kinds of extreme temperatures. Other rations were also developed, like the K-ration. All of this wartime food was a way for soldiers to live on the battlefield properly and last. But it was also something the government gave away to the masses when they were struggling with the effects of the war. Despite how hard it was to get normal chocolate, it wasn't that uncommon to see people with ration chocolate in their homes, though it didn't taste as good either. So, the hard part about this entire stretch of American history was the massive toll it took on basic necessities that people have always had growing up in their life. Ever remember a time when mineral white sugar wasn't a reasonable purchase for you? Exactly. See, this is the kind of stuff that really gets to people, and when that happens, people find substitutes. One of the most revolutionary ones people ever found was molasses, which could work in the place of sugar in just about any culinary context. You could substitute these when you were baking a pie, making a filling, or putting together a wonderful tart. That was what you would typically make in better days, though of course wartime cooking was rarely ever that extravagant. Still, thanks to how cheap molasses were, it was easy for people to stockpile them. This meant that people got to enjoy sweet desserts in times like these, times where they really needed them, when it really mattered. Thanks to the massive shortages of food that happened during World War II, it became a pretty normal fact of life for people to constantly live off of dehydrated vegetables. I can't begin to overstate how starved people were of basic everyday goods they used to always have the money for and, moreover, were always available in stores. The lack of both of these basic assurances of your day meant that a lot of people's daily script from 8 to 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. was completely flipped on its head. Suddenly, the question of, how am I going to feed my family, became very real. Unfortunately, while questions like that were easy to ask yourself, it was hard to come up with an answer. Dehydrated vegetables were one of the first solutions people ran towards because they were easy to grow and easy to store. But even that had a lot of issues. People who had lived their entire lives in urban centers began sprawling to whatever land they could to grow crops in an attempt to boost their rations. Naturally, they had no knowledge of it, and the country wasn't really doing the best agriculturally with all of its resources focused on the war effort. Lots of crop failure was common. Despite that, some celery, carrots, and onions saved the average American household during the war a lot more than government intervention ever did. During the Second World War, a lot of basic rationing food was cooked up by the government thanks to that intervention and those relief efforts that I'm talking about. One of those was vegetable bouillon cubes, and they started to become extremely common ingredients. In the United States, food shortages during wartime were such weekly occurrences that people had pretty much accepted them as a fact of everyday life. Not that getting used to it mattered much, since hunger was still bad enough of a problem for people to get out into the streets and make as much noise as they could. Bouillon cubes were convenient and efficient and were pretty much in the same vein of food as ration chocolate was. All stuff like this actually went through the Office of Price Administration, and one of the most popular items they ever gave out was these cubes. They helped make broths and added loads of flavor to soup, and the government was, of course, quick to notice the fact that people had taken to mostly soups as far as everyday meals went. They were cheap, saved lots of space, were easy to carry around and even easier to cook, and the best part was they applied to every household. It wasn't like if you didn't have an oven, you couldn't use cubes. You could say the same for lots of things that were made popular during the war, for example, dried noodles. This was a staple that worked really well in many different places thanks to the really long lifespan of dried noodles. They're also just as easy to store as bouillon cubes and pretty cost-efficient if you think about it. All it took to gather the ingredients to make stuff like this from scratch was a few cents. It helped people restore a sense of normalcy if you ask lots of food analysts and historians. People always were used to eating spaghetti and meatballs, noodles and pastas, dishes like that since they were teenagers. It helped people relive some of the days they were used to before the constant war efforts took over the scope of their everyday lives. Plus, people often used bouillon cubes along with their dried noodles. It was things like that, which when people put together one by one, eventually started to look like something resembling a real plate of food, and that meant a lot at the time. Powdered cheese mixes, on the other hand, were a different kind of relief for the masses. While basic everyday ingredients like vegetable cubes and dried noodles restored that nostalgia of eating a good hearty dinner when people came back home from work, they weren't exactly the kind of flavors people associated with being laid up in bed, all comfortable eating your favorite little snack. Cheese was always involved in most of the comfort food that ever got popular in America, but dairy and cheese in general became extremely hard for most people to even dare to think about getting. How could you afford to spend money on things like cheese when people have been eating lentils the next day and not even a big generous helping of them, like just scraps? That's the way most people were living. If you think I might be exaggerating it, then you have to understand, America had been put through the ringer a bit before the Second World War as well. The effects of the first still hadn't fully resolved. Brands like Kraft really made their name during this time too, because it was their macaroni and cheese mix, which first came out in 1937, that really made waves for people during this time. So we've gone over the greens people eat during times like this, as well as what they substitute in the place of regular food they no longer had access to. What about the most important part of American eating? Well, naturally, you can't have a United States without protein. Canned minced meat was the general solution everybody came up with in the face of the food shortage that everybody was facing. Protein simply became a non-factor in most people's day because the best, really good, and even slightly above average cuts of meat were always rationed away by the government for the use of soldiers. That left people to start eating things like necks, feet, tongues, and other parts of animals they hadn't ever used. Things like offal eating really became popular, and one thing that really helped alleviate the shortage was canned minced meat. Canned minced meat wasn't usually pre-seasoned, though some variants did come with a lot of generous seasoning, which made it easier to keep down too. However, they were also just a bit more expensive, and people were trying their best to keep costs down on the low. Plus, loads of people had already kept a store of basic seasonings and herbs to use for situations like this. Being cost-effective was a routine for the American public by that point. So, here's a ration that was actually heavily politically charged as well. What do you think happens when you introduce canned sauerkraut, a heavily German meal, in a time when anti-German sentiment is soaring sky-high in the hearts and minds of the people? Some think this was a deliberate attempt by the American government to sway public opinion towards the takes they wanted. Sort of a try at radicalizing them by reminding them who was responsible for their current state. To promote American unity, the government even tried to get people to start calling sauerkraut something entirely different. Now it was to be known as Liberty cabbage, and this was a way for them to take the parts of German culture that they liked while distancing people overall from the image of it that already existed. This was a European German meal, and that wasn't what they wanted it to look like because it was also a fantastic ration. Hence, you saw the term Liberty cabbage being plastered all over newspapers and ads, as well as packaging. If you asked me if I think rabbit is a fine dining experience or easily available enough that it would work towards relieving national hunger and food shortages, I'd lean towards the former. But the truth may surprise you. Canned rabbit was actually a massive part of the military ration effort for many countries, and our dear old America wasn't any different. After all, across the globe, one thing was true about rabbits. They were an extremely good source of lean meat, and more importantly, there was also a point to keeping a good amount of rabbits. They reproduced pretty quickly, and what you hear about them is grounded in reality. While that might be a slightly jarring thought to have about your food during the war, thinking like that was necessary. It meant that rabbits were really well suited to the kind of environment the war had created, and canned meats like corned beef and Spam were sometimes made entirely out of the lean meat of the various rabbits you could find on land. Hunting them for sustenance also became a popular thing once again, and a lot of people even began to learn to hunt as a result of wanting to provide for their family by at least being able to take advantage of the local game and wildlife. It was a free and tasty source of nutrition, and that wasn't something people were going to miss out on. When you hear about the way people lived in the war, you might sometimes hear about things like dried gnocchi, zucchini, or pasta. We just went over dried noodles, too. Stuff like that became just a bit more realistic to make regularly thanks to the resurgence of things like soy flour. See, the difference is soy flour was made out of defatted soybeans. These soybeans have been roasted and put into a powder that makes them, for many reasons, exactly the kind of thing you would want during a war. Exactly because they're really good in terms of how much fiber they have. Besides just that, they also have an incredible amount of iron, calcium, and vitamins. It was exactly this kind of everyday nutrition that people were missing in their day. It was also leading to people experiencing levels of illness that they never had before. Soy flour helped alleviate things like this because it meant that people could have a healthy source of flour that they could also use for all kinds of cooking. So besides just canned meat and the kinds of things people were out there hunting, there was also potted meat. What was potted meat? Good question, dear viewer. It's one I asked immediately, too. You actually make this by cooking some really well-grounded meat that was then repackaged, sealed, and sold in a jar or a can of fat and broth and jelly. Basically, it meant that people were able to get a long-lasting source of meat that could suit everyone's household. After all, not everyone was equipped and loaded with a fridge to work with. Not everyone had a basement that would get cold enough in the winters either. Stuff like potted meat, canned meat. All of this was essential because it applied to more or less everyone. Why was it called potted meat in specific, though? Well, when you would prepare this kind of meat, you would make a lot of use of a pot. It was common to put that meat into the pot and cover it with fat. Then you would seal it and preserve it. Things like these were how most families lived during the World War. During the Second World War, another hobby had been acquired by the mass public, and it was actually crucial at keeping them alive. Lots of people began foraging for dried mushrooms. See, it wasn't a hobby per se for people who were living in rural areas and on the outskirts of society. They had pretty much been very used to already foraging for things and also got ahead of the game when the trend first took over. People foraged for all kinds of reasons, but the chief one among everyone's list was always that it was free. It was the best thing to do and the best thing to look for during the war too, because mushrooms, more than anything else they were so good at doing, they could add an incredible amount of flavor to whatever it was you were making. This meant that people could enjoy meals once in a while too. I know you might have expected a practical reason like how they grew around the environment, the many nutritional benefits of mushrooms, or how long they last. But honestly, people were tired of always thinking about the pros and cons of something. Being logical is an effort, not a trait, you know? Takes energy. Energy was something people desperately lacked because they barely had any sources of joy in their day, and the fact that they could get morels, porcini, even shiitake mushrooms every once in a while definitely cheered them up during their day. Powdered malt, on the other hand, was something that also gave people another shot at making the things they used for comfort. People used powdered malt in baking and for making drinks at home, which was a pretty treasured source of that energy I was just talking about. You should never underestimate the importance of a good drink, especially because it's so good at lifting your mood up. Powdered malt also worked as a fantastic substitute for sugar since that was pretty much rationed heavily throughout the war. Bakers either went out of business if they couldn't access it, or they relied entirely on powdered malt to keep themselves going. After all, what's a dessert without a sweetener? Malt extracts had things like glucose and maltose, which were pretty much the entire point of sugar to begin with. They were also helpful in keeping the ingredients you did have last longer. If you were starting to run just a bit low on your supply of molasses, then you would go for powdered malt, which was also easily available. Another powdered mix that got really popular was all the kinds of lemonade mixes that started popping out during this stretch of the 20th century too. By 1927, you had the first ever Kool-Aid, courtesy of Edwin Perkins. It didn't really get widespread appeal until the war, since it was right during this time that it became a part of those food relief campaigns. Even by the company itself, it was always marketed as one of the cheapest drinks you could get. Plus, toddlers were massive suckers for those colorful packets they always had on display at stores. If you want to go a bit further than the conventional, then you have a lot of local lemonade brand mixes to look forward to as well. There were all kinds of people who were attempting their best to try to get more vitamin C because the Dust Bowl had also happened shortly before the Second War. Combined with how poorly people were living, it meant that skin issues were pretty much a regular fact of life for people. Sorghum syrup had 3 great uses during the war that the United States had actively participated in. It was something the government could rely on both for the people of America and the country's soldiers. So it became a key player just off of that alone. Secondly, most areas already had a knack for sorghum, and it was the more affordable option for a lot of different regions. This was thanks to most places producing their own sorghum, and that's why the disruption in the global supply chain hadn't really affected sorghum production too badly. That's a factor that lots of people don't talk about enough, but supplies for the entire world had become low everywhere by this point. Sorghum was a great alternative to sugar, molasses, and malts, and it helped to keep some of this in store as well. Sorghum also had a bit of magnesium, but it was a really good source of iron. It was also a wonderful sweetener, and this was actually a part of an overall bigger movement. For the first time in a while, the mainstream masses were delving into the culture that was out there in America. Sorghum syrup was a niche part of American syrups, for example, but in folk traditions, it's always been wildly popular. The war was just the first time the general public explored those traditions. Speaking of good replacements, canned chicory roots were a really good substitute for sweet coffee, since the lack of sugar meant that most people focused on preserving their sugar rather than spending it on tea for its herbal prose or the benefits of caffeine, and because most people wanted to sleep the days away, people stopped drinking it as much. Plus, disruptions in the global and domestic supply of coffee thanks to the war made sure that there was ample enough room in people's everyday lives for canned chicory roots. Coffee was still a big part of daily life for lots of Americans. Don't get me wrong. It was just as necessary as anything else, but people just couldn't be wasting their sugar on it. They still needed it in some shape or form, though, and the rations on coffee put in place by the government weren't helpful. Between the 30s and 40s, coffee's price went up badly too. Combined with the sugar, it just meant that it was too expensive of a cost to make a cup of joe. Canned chicory roots were able to take advantage of this by almost perfectly imitating the feeling of coffee, being a local substitute, and being pretty inexpensive. Now, this might surprise you, but powdered gelatin was genuinely also popular during the Second World War. This was essentially entirely due to the restriction on meats and fats and how gelatin was used as a substitute in those scenarios. See, people needed fillers in their dishes badly, and gelatin just happened to be a really good one. You could also not cut too deeply into your dairy or meat reserves if you were relying on gelatin. A low-cost and stable product was perfect for the kind of life people were living during the war, and powdered gelatin was cheap too. People had also really begun relying on foraging and growing their own fruits, and a big way to make them taste and feel better as well as become heavier as a meal was to mix in gelatins and make salads out of them. Plus, fruit-flavored gelatin had also become really popular. Most families would try to make use of canned fruits too. It helped to put a bunch of really cheap and low-cost ingredients together for a fulfilling meal, rather than focusing too heavily on exhausting one ingredient and making it the centerpiece of your entire meal. What germ was one of the best parts of the entire kernel of wheat in general? It was that embryo that was loaded with all kinds of nutrients, and neither the people nor the government was going to miss that opportunity. They popularized it as one of the most highly nutritional foods you could get your hands on during the war, especially because of it being a source of rare vitamins like E. Wartime usage meant that there was an extreme amount of use for germ. But how were people using it? Well, lots of wartime recipes that would instead call for flour, or carbs like bread, would instead use wheat germ. Lots of people managed to make enough granola to run around one household at least with a good supply of wheat germ. It also helped lots of people bake things they otherwise couldn't. One of the better parts of being able to cook different kinds of things like that is that people started to remember that cooking was also a hobby for them, a way to let some steam out and take the edge off. Plus, wheat germ was also really good at giving you some much-needed protein, which was something people wanted to be putting in their diets as much as they regularly could, to be honest. Turnip greens were also really helpful because they meant that you could get basic things like brine and other kinds of vegetable-based dishes when you really didn't want to spend resources on anything else. Sometimes it helps to save the little bits of ham and meat, the scraps and leftovers, for when you may really end up needing it later. In times like that, it meant that people barely had anything to eat, and turnips really helped. Turnips were one of the best kinds of leafy greens for the American diet during the Second World War because you could can them, you could pickle them, you could transport them easily, and you could also bake them. If you didn't have access to any kind of oven or couldn't afford one either, then you could also make use of turnips by simply boiling them. You could serve them with mashed potatoes and honestly make a pretty decent meal out of it too. Plus, they were really popular to use during the victory gardens that had started popping up during the wartime in people's backyards. Being able to grow your own produce was a milestone achievement for the American people in times like this, and it meant that they could get a steady supply of things like turnips, at least. Canned coconut milk was also really one of the best kinds of things you could ever get. Whether you wanted to use it for baking, for making savory dishes, or just salvaging that bread pudding, it was one of the most convenient things people had access to. Canned coconut milk was also a side effect of all the different kinds of trade opportunities that were opening up for America thanks to their new prospects with the Pacific at the time. You know, despite what the war period would have you believe, loving thy neighbor is still the best way to live. Also, canned coconut milk was a fantastic alternative to the use of dairy, which was something people were really desperately trying to avoid. Along with germ and turnips, it made up the bulk of the basic kinds of things people were eating throughout this rough period. Canned coconut milk was also a part of the larger efforts of the government to keep nutrition somewhat manageable throughout this time. The back-to-back effects of the recession and the Dust Bowl on top of the Second World War, people were really struggling badly to keep up with their health in this time. Coconut milk was something you could literally prepare on an open fire too, which meant that it was really manageable for everyone to handle. You wanted things that required the least amount of kitchen appliances possible during a time like this. It meant that it was a lot more applicable to the places that were struck the hardest by everything going on in the country at the time of the 1930s. So, one of the most commonly used substitutes for sugar in the war period was easily barley malt syrup. Do you enjoy baking things? Maybe you like whipping up the odd batch of bread and cookies together, or maybe you like some other stuff people do with sugar. Candies, syrups, and lots of sweet treats wouldn't be the same without all their sweeteners. We wouldn't even have good old root beer without it. Barley malt syrup helped people in the making of all of this, including bootleg alcohol that they would make using moonshine in the comfort of their own homes. While of course its usage after the war was nothing to write home about, during the war it spread like absolute wildfire. This was also because barley malt syrup was one of the best preservatives around. It was used to make jams and other kinds of fruit preserves. The idea was to get as much as you could of what would last for as long as possible, so in that regard I get it. It was popular domestically in homes, and it gave industrial food producers a chance at a low-cost sweetener too, so really, nobody really hated this. Canned liver spreads were a part of the several different kinds of processed foods that those same industries I'm talking about started whipping up to help with the relief efforts. There was a massive need for food that was nutritionally sound and also really convenient. Some people think that the over-reliance on convenient food that was a last-ditch Band-Aid fix instead of actual proper channels of distribution for food that dealt with the shortages is what led to Americans and their whole deal with convenience food culture. Wartime rationing was badly handled, and that's just a historical fact. Canned foods made life easier for both soldiers and civilians in general. They were the kind of stuff that would last you months and would also be a good source of much-needed protein. People started to eat different kinds of animal meat that they never had thought of eating before, and canned liver was a part of this. While liver itself was common in some traditions and cultures, such as Native American cultures, Middle Eastern communities, and indigenous tribes across America, it had never hit the suburbs like it did during this time. Canned liver spreads meant that your average breakfast consisting of homemade stale bread, crackers, and toast also was just a bit more exciting than usual. Speaking of influences from different cultures, lots of Americans began to take a lot of advantage of pemmican. This was typically something that was always a Native American food, and it had a massive part to play in how people were going to be eating during the Second World War. Its use was a bit niche, and it was definitely heavily regional. If you weren't living in the right place, such as the western parts of America and the South, you would almost never encounter this. The U.S. military had the opposite experience with pemmican, on the other hand. They wanted food that was high-calorie and easy to carry around, and this is exactly what pemmican was like. It was typically made by drying bison, which have an extreme importance in Native American culture. It was very important for bison populations to be treated with respect, but the over-reliance on pemmican meant that they were also farmed and butchered more than they usually ever would have been. However, this also meant that traditional pemmican was the perfect thing to eat during the war. Canned applesauce powder was something that hadn't really taken solid form as a concept until the war. There was a lot of use for drying fruits and vegetables as a way to help extend the shelf life of people. It was really hard for people to get vitamin C, and applesauce itself was a really good pureed form of apples that was helpful in providing exactly those kinds of vitamins that people lacked. The inherent sugar that apples had was also something that really helped the population during this time. Dehydrated applesauce was common, but to make it in the form of powder wasn't something that people had experimented with. The technique for this came about thanks to the war efforts, and it was entirely a gamble to make applesauce more transportable. Can you imagine the government delegating real-time resources and efforts to making applesauce easier to carry? It actually does things like that very often. The aim was to make something that both civilians and soldiers could benefit from, and I think they nailed it. Ever become fond of plum pudding around Christmas? The culture and tradition surrounding that actually started thanks to the Second World War. Most people would typically make their plum pudding with a lot more fanciness than they did back then, but canned plum pudding was something people were thankful to be having at all. After the Pearl Harbor attack, there was an extreme increase in the intensity of the overall war effort. This was a time when rationing hit the people basically the hardest, and almost every basic necessity was immediately taken away from people. They had no way to cope, and to be fair, the entire script was just flipped on its head. Lots of different parts of the government tried to make canned plum pudding out to be one of the top combatants against hunger for people, and they were somewhat successful. Many people did buy this and use it in their baking and daily cooking, but it also didn't work as well as they had hoped. Lots of people lived too far away from the places and stores that were selling it, and the massive amounts of shortages meant that people would finish up supplies long before the people living far away ever got to them. Beef barley soup is but a humble dish that comes right from tales of peasant wives making hearty breakfasts for their families. Sorry for sounding like a Lord of the Rings extra for a second. Really though, beef barley soup is as vintage as a recipe can get. Barley itself is one of the most ancient grains we have, not just in the States, but all across the world. Again, the idea of pairing it with beef is something we took from our European buddies that immigrated to Uncle Sam's greener pastures. When they weren't looking so green, and trust me, the 1930s and 40s were a long time, it was in everyone's mutual interest to play it smart. By that I mean there was a lot of inspiration to take from all the different communities around in the States. What is America if not a melting pot of different cultures? Beef barley soup used a lot less meat than the recipe typically calls for. but the substitute of roasted vegetables really brought it all together in a wonderful way. It was now not just a peasant dish for field workers, but something everyone had daily, because it was the best they could get. It was rare to get protein from actual meat during that period, but that didn't stop people from fulfilling their cravings by dabbling in mock cuisine, such as the popular mock fish fillet. While this did not actually use fish, it imitated the texture and flavor with pints of milk brought to boil, ground rice, chopped onion, and leeks, with the end being a good stir in a properly beaten egg. What you had was an excellent mimicry that felt close enough to the real thing while being distinct and offering a new experience. Nowadays, this recipe is used in vegan communities, but its origins come from very anti-vegan places, and it would be a great substitute for actual fish and chips as well. The magic of salt pork was always something you could count on during the Great Depression. This heavily salted slab of fatty meat was a lifeline for families trying to stretch meals to infinity and beyond. Refrigeration was a luxury for many, and salt pork's long shelf life made it an indispensable pantry item. Salt pork wasn't just a food, it was an ingredient, a seasoning, and sometimes a main course. It flavored beans, greens, and soups, enough to give even the simplest dishes a little indulgence. When we were leaner, we'd fry up a small piece of salt pork and use the rendered fat to cook everything else. The result? A meal that had the feel of more meat than it actually had. However, it wasn't all plain sailing. The salt pork was so salty that it often had to be soaked or boiled before eating. It was affordable, versatile, and practically indestructible. A trifecta of survival during tough times. Salt pork is much more likely to appear in gourmet kitchens than in emergency pantries today. But back then, it was a salty superhero, rescuing countless Depression-era meals from bland oblivion. Spam and eggs was a classic during World War II when Spam was not only dirt cheap, but also readily available everywhere. Spam's reputation as one of the heartiest, affordable, and long-lasting meat products made it a perfect fit for the tough times. Plus, its delicious taste spoke for itself. I mean, imagine a salty, processed meat block nestled next to a sunny side-up egg. It's a match made in, wartime necessity. It originated during the Great Depression era, but World War II is when it became a hit around the globe. Now, let's be honest, it's not exactly gourmet. Spam continued to be popular in the post-war era and became a staple in most American households. While Spam is still around today, it's no longer the breakfast star it once was. Split pea soup was always something that we enjoyed greatly, mostly thanks to our European neighbors in the States. They didn't become a nationwide sensation until the Depression and World War II hit, though. That entire period actually saw an insane spike in the general perception of beans, peas, and lentils. Basically, anything that was vaguely similar to that was suddenly God's greatest gift to Earth. This doesn't just have to do with the times being hard and there being a massive war going on either. It has to do, again, with some age-old state-backed peer pressure. A lot of people were lost in the face of rations and surpluses that just didn't make the cut or last very long. The tensions with the government were extraordinarily high, especially with a lot of people just being tired of the war effort. The government of the United States of America decided to encourage people to cultivate some new hobbies in these trying times. One of those happens to be foraging, and it was just as convenient as it sounds. Free food that you can gather right from nature itself, that no one has to pay for? You can definitely see why something like that went mainstream. Bubble and squeak was something that completely fit the situations most people would find themselves in during the war, because this dish is all about the leftovers. Usually, Sunday dinner's leftovers would be used in a bubble and squeak to make sure nothing went to waste. Plus, people would definitely take that sentiment to heart when it came to holiday dinners where there were enough things left to constitute at least 2 or 3 meals the next day. Usually, this dish is made with potatoes and cabbage and is fried, so it goes properly and amazingly with some potato flotties or other items on the list. Maybe you can take a note from people's books the next time you think you have nothing to eat, but plenty of things still left. Hominy was a humble kitchen staple during the Great Depression, and it stretched far and wide. Hominy puffed up into soft, chewy nuggets made by soaking dried corn kernels in lye. Yes, lye. and as versatile as they were filling. Hominy may not have been glamorous, but it did the job. Hominy made its way into soups, casseroles, and even as a side dish fried. A texture party, it gave simple meals a satisfying chew. It became the base for Southern favorites like grits for those who could afford a little extra seasoning. It was a hearty, starchy savior on lean days for everyone else. Hominy was often prepared in large batches, which they dried and stored for future use. This wasn't just food, it was an investment for the long term, so you wouldn't go hungry. Making hominy wasn't exactly convenient, but it was worth it when food supplies were low. Hominy is still a staple in some cuisines, but it's long since faded from everyday American tables. But for those who lived through the Great Depression, this unassuming corn product was a lifeline. And once again, necessity is the mother of culinary invention. So jellied consommé is a clear soup set in gelatin. It is made from richly flavored stock or broth that has been clarified, which is a process that uses egg whites to remove fat. So not only does it taste good, but it's healthy too. It's like someone decided to turn soup into a science experiment. This strange soup originated in the UK and has many variations, including double consommé, which is basically the same recipe with twice the amount of meat used. This dish was all the rage back in the day, probably because people thought it looked fancy. But let's be real, it's more like a horror movie prop than a food. Can you imagine slurping up that wobbly, gelatinous broth? I'm not sure my stomach could handle it. And that's probably the reason why we don't see this one on our dinner tables anymore. You'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put two and two together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. If people can make an entire fake fish fillet and still be pretty satisfied with it, then other meaty wonders like liver definitely are not too far off the horizon, and chopped liver substitute would eventually prove that right. Something that became incredibly popular in the war-torn landscape of America because all it took was some onions, green lentils, walnuts, and salt and pepper. You had to make a paste out of it to get the texture of chopped liver down, and in terms of taste, this was a completely new experience, yet a significantly cheaper and easier one. It was much easier to get ingredients like these than good quality liver back then, and a lot of citizens stuck with this recipe even after the dust settled because they liked how healthy of an alternative it was. Hardtack, also known as the cracker that could survive the apocalypse, was a Depression-era favorite for those wanting to stockpile something that wouldn't spoil. It was a rock-hard biscuit made of nothing but flour, water, maybe a pinch of salt. Nothing special, but dependable. Hardtack was a legacy food, one with military rations and sailor diets pedigree. It was a Depression-era hit because families could stash it in pantries without fear of spoilage. Plain, it was like gnawing on a brick. It was almost edible, but softened with soup, milk, or coffee, it became almost edible. Emphasis on almost. Hardtack was bland, but there was something charming about it. It was cheap, easy to make, and incredibly filling. It was the base for many families' meals when ingredients were scarce. It thickened stews, broken into crumbs, or was an impromptu plate when real dishware wasn't an option, left whole. Today, hardtack is more of a historical curiosity than a pantry must-have. However, during the Great Depression, this humble cracker represented resilience. It wasn't fancy or flavorful, but it kept people going when times were tough, and that's what mattered. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches, were once a lunchtime favorite. Liverwurst or liver sausage is a kind of sausage made from liver, so it was the perfect meal for when no part of the animal could go to waste. There were very limited meats available during the World Wars, and people had to use whatever they could find, including livers and hearts. Liverwurst was often spread thickly on rye bread and topped with thinly sliced onions. This sandwich was very popular in Europe and different parts of South America, such as Argentina and Chile. I don't know about you, but the combination of iron-rich liver and pungent onion doesn't sit right with me. It was like a flavor explosion in your mouth, but not in a good way. I'm pretty sure this sandwich was invented as a punishment, but people really had to make do with whatever they could find back in the day, and this dish was just a result of that experiment. I'm going to have to go back to talking about how much we've borrowed from our British friends over in the United Kingdom. Bubble and squeak is quintessential British food after all. It was pretty genius too. This shares a theme with the picnic casseroles we just discussed because both were phenomenal ways to repurpose your leftovers. A lot of these dishes were powerhouses made exclusively out of stuff that was either left behind or simply was about to go bad. The earliest mention of bubble and squeak is in the 1700s, and that's just a pretty bare-bones meat and cabbage dish. Over time, it was adapted to the current situation, and meatless versions were made popular. These ones just prioritized using potatoes and vegetables, basically anything high in fiber. The reason you'd want that is because it'd keep you full for longer, which was always a godsend during the war. The potatoes would work as a binding agent. The leftover vegetables were chopped and mixed in for nutrition, and if you got super lucky, some corned beef or bacon would work really well for flavor. As far as the culture goes, bubble and squeak really emphasize the mentality of wasting absolutely nothing. Despite how humble the recipe is, it's definitely something that brought comfort to a lot of families. War or no war, who can say some mashed potatoes and greens haven't cheered them up at some point? Mock cuisine in general really saw its heyday during the harsh times of rationing, especially with all the things that were famously eaten before times got so bad, like brain. People wanted more of their favorites, even if they had to compromise in some way. And things like mock brains would become really popular as a result. Known for being quite heavy on the seasoning and being laced with fat, they incorporated basic spices like hickory smoke, paprika, and garlic. People would typically have it with a tomato sauce if they could spare the ingredients, and it definitely scratched that itch that lots of US meat lovers were having around the nation. Kraut juice. It's just what it sounds like. During the Great Depression, fermented cabbage brine was a go-to pantry item, prized for its versatility and surprising nutritional benefits. It was a byproduct of sauerkraut making, and wasting it was out of the question. Straight down the throat for its purported health benefits as a cooking liquid for soups and stews, or even as a splash to bland foods to add flavor. Basically, it was the Depression-era version of an electrolyte drink, thought to help digestion and keep people going when fresh produce was scarce. But the taste was divisive. You either loved it or learned to tolerate it. Kraut juice had its good points too. It was cheap, it kept forever, and it was surprisingly rich in vitamins and probiotics. It was a lifeline in a jar for families with limited resources. Kraut juice has faded from the household staple, but it hasn't gone away altogether. Some old-school recipes still use it, and occasionally it's sipped as a health tonic. For the people who lived through the Great Depression, kraut juice wasn't a health trend. It was a necessity. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, one briny sip at a time. Meatloaf. Who doesn't love this classic comfort food? But what happens when you get a sweet craving and add a little twist to it? Well, you get meatloaf with brown sugar glaze. Meatloaf is a traditional German, Scandinavian, and Belgian dish, and it is a cousin to the meatball in Dutch cuisine. But a brown sugar glaze? That's where things got exciting. This dish was a culinary experiment of the way days, and it's safe to say it was a huge success. Every continent came up with their own variations of this dinner, and it became a centerpiece at every dinner table. It was basically combining ground meat, breadcrumbs, and spices, topped with a caramelized brown sugar and ketchup glaze. What could go wrong with that? Meatloaf is still a staple for most people around the world, but you don't really see it get paired with a brown sugar glaze anymore. It was just a post-war craving, I guess. So you might be surprised to hear party franks on this list. Just because the times were as tough as they were doesn't mean people forgot how to have fun. Party franks today are pretty much just an appetizer at family gatherings and potlucks, but back then, it was totally different. There was this entire concept of community-based cooking that was pretty much exclusive to that time period. Neighborhoods would pool their resources and pantries together. They'd cook up a storm for the whole block, and it would leave everyone fulfilled and satisfied. The idea was that people would get more variety, nutrition, and overall food if everyone shared an agreed amount from the get-go. Party franks were perfect for situations like this because it was extremely easy to prepare for an entire group of people. When I say group, I mean at least a dozen plus, not a family of 4. You'd have pigs in a blanket with sausages wrapped in leftover dough, or you'd have them sliced into tiny bits and added to stews, soups, and sometimes even sandwiches. It was a little way to add some flavor and style to otherwise pretty plain meals. People that grew up during World War II will know that mixing sawdust with bread to fortify it so that your supply would last twice as long is not quite the urban myth it is made out to be today, but rather a sad fact of a dark time that people would prefer to leave in the past. This was something born purely out of necessity and a lack of basic necessities like flour. Since it was becoming so scarce across America, people's supplies of bread were running out fast and often. Bread was the only thing families had to eat too. With even that comfort gone, people took to mixing sawdust, which you could even taste in the bread. In some cases, it made the bread go bad faster, such as people when used too much of it. But in most other appliances of this technique, it worked as a filler when nothing else could be used as one. This would also set up a trend of consuming fiber in the 70s, even though most companies used cellulose fiber that was made from sawdust. So it actually does have quite a history in America. Canned ham was like the instant ramen of foods back in the post-war days. In 1940, it started gaining traction as the miracle meat during World War II. It was also transported as an aid to Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Canned ham was nothing fancy, which was the best thing about this meal. It was perfect for busy households or people on the run. Plus, its long shelf life was like the cherry on top. Back in the day, this was a convenience food dream come true. No fuss, no muss, just a whole lot of ham. But let's be real. Fresh ham is where it's at. Unless you're stranded on a desert island, I'd stick to the deli counter. We don't need to punish ourselves with canned meat anymore, which is why this dinner has become a part of ancient history. Smoked picnic ham with brown sugar was another really inexpensive way to stretch ingredients without breaking the bank. You might not know, but refined sugar actually pretty much became a myth in homes back then. In more bougie neighborhoods, sure, you'd pop open a cabinet and see some sitting pretty, but for everyone else, that just wasn't the case. Refined sugar was a rarity and also an expensive ingredient to buy. Brown sugar, on the other hand, was the perfect fix. Cheap, available easily, and barely distinguishable, it was the backbone of a lot of wartime cooking. Also, the smoked picnic ham isn't really authentic either, at least not in the way you're thinking. Ham usually is made from the hind leg, but picnic ham is cured, and it's cut out of the shoulder. It's got mostly the same texture, but it's a bit on the cheaper side because it's tougher and has a higher fat percentage, which wasn't really a bad thing. I mean, the people were definitely lacking some of that in their diet. Smoked picnic hams with brown sugar were most regularly made around things like Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a nifty little way to make everyone feel like they were celebrating. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. So, for onions stuffed with grape nuts, you needed nothing that fancy, not even a lot of seasoning outside of your basic salt and pepper. All you needed was 1.5 cups of pork sausage meat, some melted fat, ketchup, and if you could spare some strips, then bacon. Of course, the key player, grape nuts, would come later when the onions would be chopped and diced mixed with the sausage and the other ingredients. This was then baked for around 40 minutes, and the outcome was a resounding yes from everyone at the dinner table. Dishes that were simple but incredibly effective at filling everyone and leaving them with a happy smile were the holy grail of the 40s and 50s. I never knew fat could be the unsung hero of the Great Depression. Sweet, the solid white fat from the loins or kidneys of sheep and cows, was much more than a pantry staple. It was a survival tool. Sweat was once prized for its versatility, being used in cooking, baking, and even non-food uses such as making candles and soap. When resources were scarce and people had to make the most of every morsel, it was the original all-in-one solution. Sweat was a game-changer in the kitchen. It gave the dishes of meat pies, puddings, and dumplings richness, which helped to make them hearty enough to stretch a meal for an entire family. During the colder months, when energy reserves were important, its high-calorie content made it essential. Suet wasn't just for savory dishes either, with recipes like suet pudding turning this otherwise savory staple into a sweet one. In addition to its utility, suet was available. It was often considered a byproduct by butchers and sold cheaply, so even the most cash-strapped families could afford it. It was also easy to render and store and kept for months when properly handled. Suet has pretty much disappeared from modern kitchens, but it occasionally makes an appearance in traditional recipes. It was more than just fat to those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a lifeline in Lard's clothing. Creamed chipped beef on toast, often referred to as SOS, was a popular military meal that made its way into civilian kitchens. Now, this one was equal parts comforting and questionable. Think of it as dried beef, reconstituted into a creamy, salty sauce, and then plopped on top of toast. It's like someone tried to make a fancy grilled cheese, but accidentally ended up in the Weird Food Hall of Fame. I'm not saying it's bad, but it's definitely a unique flavor profile. It was also known as fizzled beef and was served as breakfast in many diners across the U.S. during the post-war days. And it wasn't just limited to toast. Chipped beef was also often served on bagels, English muffins, biscuits, home fries, rice, mashed potato, and in casserole. Some people even tried flavoring it with Worcestershire sauce. Yeah, now we're talking. This one's faded from our dinner tables but hasn't been able to escape our memories just yet. Potato cakes were pretty much the go-to option for almost everyone during the war period. You have to keep in mind that the country was still juggling the effects of the Great Depression too. Both of them in tandem really made it hard for people to get much else. As good as potatoes can be, especially when you serve them up in cake form, it can get a little stale. When you eat it as much as they did, it gets pretty hard to be excited for it. One way to really spice them up was to pair your potato cakes with fried onions. Sounds simple, but that's pretty much what sums up wartime cooking. Simple, efficient little tricks that make a world of difference. Potatoes were already a wartime staple. They were the easiest crop to grow around, and both rural farmers and government bigwigs took notice of that. This was a simple and amazing way to get some easy comfort and keep bellies full. Also, another thing that made these really easy was how much people traded potatoes and onions. It was really common to barter with vegetables. That meant that the recipe got around. It was in community cookbooks too, so there was no shortage of positive PR for it. I guess you could say it's pretty deserved, wouldn't you say? Cottage cheese being used as a substitute for meat is another factor of cooking that you probably never thought was possible, but is actually well documented. Even the Department of Agriculture agrees that it is a pretty rocking substitute for meat as it contains a lot of protein. And when you need to get your macros in on a budget, you cannot be complaining about the source. Sure, everyone would love to fulfill their battle-action protagonist fantasies of chowing down trays and trays of meat, but we only need so many grams of protein in a day to make a bulk. Dry curd cottage cheese especially contains more protein per pound than beef or lamb, and only chicken and veal beat it at that game. It seems there is a lot of cooking know-how that can be picked up from Americans living in those times. When the Great Depression hit, sorghum syrup ruled the roost as the king of sweeteners. Honey maple syrup be damned. This thick, golden brown liquid was made by boiling down the juice of sorghum cane, and it was a lifeline for families trying to sweeten their lives without breaking the bank. It was affordable and versatile enough to earn a permanent place in Depression-era pantries. Sorghum syrup was not just a sweetener. It was a source of vital nutrients such as iron, calcium, and magnesium. It wasn't just tasty, it was functional, in an era when balanced meals were often a luxury. Sorghum on a biscuit, cornbread, or oatmeal could make a meager breakfast something special. It even made its way into sauces, marinades, baked goods, and even into ice cream. Sorghum syrup production was a community affair. During harvest time, people gathered in entire neighborhoods to crush sorghum stalks and boil the juice into syrup. It was labor-intensive, but it was also social, and it forged bonds even in the darkest of times. Back then, it wasn't about foodie trends, but today, sorghum syrup is experiencing a small renaissance in the culinary world. It was about survival, resourcefulness, and getting as much goodness as we could out of the land. Sorghum syrup wasn't just a treat for Depression-era families. It was a symbol of sweetness that endured in hard times. While we're on the topic of ham, this next dish added a fruity twist to it. Yep, we're talking about ham and banana hollandaise. Sweet banana, salty ham, and rich, creamy hollandaise sauce. Some might call it adventurous, others might call it a crime against food. This dish made a lot of buzz in the 1970s, and bananas have never appeared more out of their element ever since. It was featured in McCall's Great American Recipe Card collection in 1973 and took the world by storm due to its uniqueness. The hollandaise was a creamy sauce, first born in France and was originally known as sauce Isigny, named after a small town in Normandy, famous for its butter and cream. This dish really proves that in a time of desperation, anyone will eat anything. But hey, at least it was memorable. Scrambled eggs had a massive makeover during the World War. It was a lot more common to add chopped parsley and chives to them rather than bacon and hash browns. Rationing efforts meant that a lot of basic ingredients were amiss, not just meat. While people were fighting over scraps of bacon, the sudden egg shortage really took them by surprise. Eggs were a pretty common breakfast, which I think is true of anywhere in the world. They were also a wonderful source of protein, so I'm sure you can figure out why the government wanted all the eggs to themselves. Dried, powdered eggs supplemented with water were used instead. You'd use the water and whisk them until they'd reach something that still resembled the texture of a fresh egg. Then, if you could afford to, you'd use some powdered milk to further make it resemble your typical plate of scrambled eggs. That raised another concern, which was, well, the powdered eggs are running out too fast. The solution people came up with at that point was to use fillers like vegetables, the parsley and chives, to fatten the egg up a bit. Make it a bit more substantial, you know? I have to say, I think they did a pretty clean job with it. Ever thought you would have a Cassie with no meat in it? An economy loaf is just that, and we could not have named it better if you put a gun to our head. Using potatoes, peas, flour, eggs, and some basic seasoning, this was a loaf made entirely of alternatives to meat, so for vegans it is a recipe to keep in mind throughout the ages. But in the rationing-ridden times of World War II, it was a godsend to have this quick and easy loaf. It was even popular enough to be in cookbooks like The Modern Hostess, even its special patriotic edition. Roosevelt's presidency really saw some gems, right? Pickled vegetables were the ultimate solution for long-term nourishment when fresh produce was a fleeting luxury. Families in the Great Depression knew how to make their gardens work overtime, and pickling was a go-to way to stretch the harvest into lean winter months. If it grew, it could be pickled. Cucumbers, green beans, cabbage, and even watermelon rinds were preserved in tangy brine. The process was simple but ingenious. Jars were packed with vegetables, vinegar, salt, and spices to become shelf-stable pantry stars. Preserving food with pickling didn't just preserve the food, it elevated it. Pickled vegetables gave sharp, zesty flavors to otherwise bland meals, bringing a taste of summer to the dead of winter. Pickling was more than a food preservation method. It was a communal activity. Neighbors swapped jars, families shared brine recipes, and pickling became a way to connect during hard times. Nothing was wasted. Even scraps that would have otherwise been discarded had a second life in the pickle jar. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Pickled vegetables are a trendy addition to charcuterie boards these days. But during the Depression, they were a necessity. But for families who were barely making ends meet, A pantry full of jars of pickled vegetables wasn't just a source of food, it was a source of pride and security. If you're a fan of pineapple on pizza, you would have loved this next one. Pineapple and cheese salad was a unique delight back in the day. This dish came into existence when someone decided to mix pineapple and cheese together in times of misery. Imagine cubes of pineapple in a creamy cheese mixture, terrifying or finger-licking delicious? There's no in-between. This was a variation of the infamous candle salad, which was a vintage fruit salad popular in America in the 1920s and was typically composed of lettuce, pineapple, banana, cherry, and either mayonnaise or cottage cheese. This was considered a luxurious delicacy during the tough times of the war, but just fails to meet the standards now. It's still a great way to use up leftover pineapple from your holiday punch if you're ever feeling adventurous. That wraps up the list of stockpiled foods in the World War. Share with us which food stood out to you the most below in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.